I'm from the Fudan University's International School of Finance and also the Fudan Financial Review. Welcome to an online course series brought to you by CGTN Think Tank and the Fudan Financial Review. So we're going to have two parts of today's live broadcast. In the first half, I'll give a talk about the economic initiatives and the situation about Chinese economic recovery after more or less 2 months of lockdown. And then in the second part, we'll be joined by three guests, one in Singapore. So good evening for people watching in the Asia Pacific region. Another guest from London, good afternoon. And also finally a guest from New York, good morning. So I'll start my talk. So I'll cover three topics. I'll show you some data, economic indicators of the economic recovery. Here I'm going to be using different parts of the data set come from the Official Statistics Bureau. Also, thanks to WeBank, a new financial institution, their AI group developed this China Economic Recovery Index. I'll show you what's it about. And I'll also show you some surveys done by industry associations about specific sectors, how they're recovering. So that's the first part. And then in the second part, I'll talk about ongoing monetary and fiscal policies by the central government, by the local government. And also, I'll say a few words about Chinese capital markets, focusing on the stock market and also the government bond market. And finally, we'll talk about small and medium enterprises. We know they are very important worldwide. There's a large number of these SMEs in China. We'll talk about the challenges they're facing as they go back to work. And also, I'll talk about opportunities. So that's the plan. So I'll start with some aggregate economic indicators. These are official statistics. So I'm showing four sets of data. The first two, retail sales and also investment in fixed assets. These are numbers updated every month, with the exception that in January and February, they only announced once. Okay, that's one. Two, these numbers are actually accumulated. So when you see a bar, let's say at the end of 2019, let's say October of 2019, that's actually data for that category accumulated from the beginning of the year all the way till that month, and then compared to the same period a year ago. All right, so that's how these two top charts are created. So as you can see, we see a huge dip in retail sales, consumption goods, not surprising. Also very large drop, more than 20% in total investment in fixed assets. And then the bottom two charts, we're looking at industrial value added and also PMI. For industrial value added, it's actually they have data for January and February. So not surprising, we see a much bigger drop in February, more than 10%. PMI, this is a monthly data series, so we see a drop in February, but actually a very quick rebound in March. So obviously the overall economy was hit pretty hard in February. It started to recover in March. That's sort of the overall picture from these figures. Import and export. So here comes some new data. So again, this data series is announced every month, but only once in January, February, because of the Chinese New Year. So again, the blue bars are for export, the red bars for import. Once again, you will see that these bars in 2019, these are percentage increase over the same period a year ago. So again, when you see, let's say we take the bar 2019-11, that's November of 2019. That's actually data accumulated from January all the way to November of 2019. Okay, so overall, you see that in the year 2019, the rate of increase in export and import is very low relative to 2017 and 2018. So again, export is still increasing, but increasing at a much lower rate compared to 2 years before. A lot of factors contributed to that. In fact, the Chinese economy now relies less on export and import than before. But nevertheless, 2019, the overall this year, we see a drop in the increase of export and import. And then boom, coming to 2020, we see that for the months of January and February, the export drops. The number is 15.4 to 15.6%, and then import drop less. Import drops about 2.4%. So export big loss in the first 2 months. Okay. So moving ahead. Moving ahead to the next slide. All right, so this is, as I mentioned, this is from the AI group. They call themselves the Moonshot team of WeBank. So WeBank is one of these very new type of financial institution. It's an online bank, basically. They lend to very small firms and also individuals. What they've done here is they created this, what they call China Economic Recovery Index. I'm showing you data, thanks to them, they released that to us. The blue line is for 2019, and then the red line is for 2020 up to this point. This data is based on actual movement. So humans going to work, going to factories, going to offices, and going to restaurants to consume, all right? So it's an overall index based on human movement. All right, so that also, for example, in the example of restaurant, for example, they also include delivery services, okay? So it's for production and for consumption. All right, and this is updated daily. So you see this chopped line going up, all right? So overall, as we go to March, the last date of this data is March 27th. It's almost at the end of March. So the overall trend is that the economic activities, for both for production and for consumption, have been recovering, okay? And relative to the activities in 2019, at the end of March, according to this data, China's economic activities are back about 86.7%, 86.7%. So that's pretty encouraging in terms of again production and also for consumption. That's the overall picture, all right? So we're getting up there. Here are 3 snapshots of that same index, but now we're looking at provincial level data. Okay, so in this map, we see three snapshots: early February, late February, and the last date of this data, which is March 27th. In the map of China, whenever you see a province that has a darker blue color, that means they're closer to full recovery. All right, so the max score is 100, and when you see light color, that's 0. All right, so clearly in the months of in the early days of February, there wasn't much going on. Okay. You see Tibet, because there wasn't much activities to begin with. For all over China was very light color, so because everybody stayed home. At the end of February, you do see that color start to become darker. And again, by the end of March, almost all the provinces turn deeper blue. Obviously, you see a very clear exception in the middle of the map. As we know, that's Hubei province, okay? So you can see that Hubei province has a very light color because, as we know, Hubei just opened. The city of Wuhan and Hubei, the Hubei province, and especially the city of Wuhan, was reopened on April the 8th. So again, this is consistent with the previous chart showing you that we are more than 86% back. This is a satellite picture of the satellite is actually, I was told the satellite is a European satellite. What's cool about this satellite is that not only it's very accurate, it can actually pick up different temperatures. So the image can show factories that's producing at different levels with different temperatures. Here is not actually a factory. This is the map of the parking lot of the Shanghai Tesla factory. Okay, end of January there were like 18 cars in that parking lot, empty. But by February 10th, it's the second set of pictures, you will see that parking lot of the factory was basically full. Again, that's consistent with actually the Shanghai Tesla went back to production almost 100% in February. So these are charts for the steel industry. So again, they call it satellite manufacturing index, and again, it's based on the image from that European satellite, which can differentiate factories with producing a different temperature or intensity. Okay, so again, you see that first picture is the fourth quarter of 2019. You see this correlation between, correlation between steel industry and the overall PMI. Not surprising, steel is a big part of manufacturing. So this is actually Q4 2019. This is recent. All right, so the blue bars are as of end of 2019. The red bars documenting, again, based on those satellite images, how the Chinese steel industry is recovering. As of late March, it's basically going back to 100%. So that's the steel industry. And then the final set of data I pull from these industry associations. So we are my school, the research team. We're talking to a large bank. Hopefully, we'll get the bank's micro level, loan level data. Will give you an even better picture about the financial situation. But these are from industry association surveys. So 3 sectors. If you look at retail, if you look at department stores, about 60% of these companies or stores have recovered more than half of the customer flows, half of their revenues. Textile is a big industry. It seems that most of these textile firms have resumed some level of production. Most of the employees have returned. That's important. But this number is also telling 80% of the surveyed companies say they don't have enough orders, they're missing orders, cancel orders, and half of them are saying they have basically cash flow problems. And then finally, we have stationery and sporting goods. You see similar pictures. All right, so that's basically the first part of the presentation where I show you some aggregate data based on human movement. It seems that the Chinese economy is slowly but surely going back to full level of production and consumption. We're showing selected industries, again, going back to full capacity, but clearly retail industries like retail are facing a lot of textile facing a lot of difficulties. All right. Second part, we'll talk about the capital markets and also Chinese monetary fiscal policies. So in here, I'm showing you 3 lines, interest rates. All right. So the lowest, this shiny yellow line. The shiny yellow line is the Chinese government bonds, a 5-year government bond. Clearly, the yield has been going down. Price has been going up. So there's also this sort of movement toward movement away from risky assets, going to safe assets in China. The data periods from beginning of January all the way to early April. So yellow, that's the Treasury bond. The darker yellow line, the brown color line, that's Shibor, that's the interbank lending rate in China. Again, it's also dropping. And the top line at the top, that's basically corporate bonds. These are safe corporate bonds, AAA rated. Again, it's so all these three lines, all these risk-free rates, and also the safe corporate bonds, prices are going up, yields are dropping. But it's important to point out that if you look at the government bond yield, it's far away from zero. Okay, so it's yielding at somewhere like 2.2%. So there's a lot more room for lowering rates if that's part of the plan for the central bank. So these are interest rates. The other thing that's important for the central bank is that for various number of reasons, Chinese banks, the banks are very important. They take a lot of wealth. They make a lot of lending. They're the most important stores of lending to the corporate sectors. So the Chinese banks' reserve ratios are high, all right, compared to other countries. At some point, if you look at 2011, the reserve ratios were as high as 20%, okay? And there are two lines here. Basically, they have different correlated, but different required reserve ratios for what we call large banks and smaller banks, okay? So if you focus on the right-hand side of the picture, this is all the way from 2006, before the last global financial crisis, all the way till the first half of this year. You will see that the central bank has cut recently, last week, in fact, they have cut the required reserve ratio for those small and medium banks. The idea being that once the required reserve ratios are lower, then the banks can lend more, okay? And the idea is that these small and medium banks, they focus on lending to SMEs. So the idea is encouraging them to lend more to help SMEs. So that's the idea. So the other point of showing you this is that in addition to cutting rates, the central bank, the Chinese central bank, can also keep cutting this required reserve ratio to further stimulate banks lending. So the other thing that central bank has done is that they also cut what's called the interest rate on the excess reserve. So banks sometimes they put, other than required reserve, they also put a little bit more at the central bank. They cut the interest rate. Again, that decreases the incentive for banks to parking money at the central bank. That should increase their lending to the outside world. They cut the rate on this excess reserve, even though it's not a big cut. This is done the first time since 2008. Okay, the PBOC also has a number of what we call liquidity facilities. The other thing to point out is that, as I said, banks are very important. If you want to name the most systemically important financial institutions, most of them are large banks. Overall, these banks are healthy. Their non-performing loans will go up slightly because of the pause in the economy. But as long as the economy goes back, the recovery process starts, that tick in NPL should be small and manageable. All right. So now coming to fiscal policy, I'm including both fiscal policies by the central and also local governments. All right. So as you've seen from other governments around the world, Chinese government has rolled out a lot of policies. The first set of policies aimed at enhancing firms' cash flows, if you will. That includes reduce taxes and fees. In fact, return paid taxes, delay all of these Social Security related payments for SMEs that actually account for a non-trivial part, again, cutting costs. Fiscal policy, they implement it through financial institutions. They basically discount for these loans, direct subsidies for R&Ds, for these so-called strategically important sectors and so forth. So again, it's boosting firms, especially SMEs, cash flows. We've seen that governments around the world have handing out money to firms and citizens. What the Chinese local governments have been doing is that a lot of provincial government and city government have handed out consumption coupons. It's not cash. Obviously, the idea is that if you give people consumption coupons, they need to use it. They need to consume. You give them cash, maybe they don't want to use that cash. If the purpose is to stimulate consumption, perhaps consumption coupons are better. There are various plans for very large government investment projects. So the phrase in China now is what's called new infrastructure projects. Okay, so China obviously did a very large-scale infrastructure project during the last round, which was after the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. China rolled out a lot of infrastructure projects, including highways, including high-speed rail. This round, a lot of people like me says, fine, new infrastructure is good, you generate both supply and demand, but the new infrastructure projects should include at least two sectors, in addition to the traditional infrastructure projects. One is technology that's crucial for digital economy, and I'll come back to that. This has become very important during the process of economic recovery. And also, without a doubt, like many other countries, China should spend more to build a better, a larger, and more efficient healthcare and medical system. So if you look at the overall spending in GDP, China spends about 6.4% roughly on healthcare, the big healthcare Medicare medical system. That's far lower than more developed economies. So I know that in the US, the number is very high, it's like 70%, but if you look at OECD economies, usually it's above 10%. So there's a lot of room for increasing investment to build up, to strengthen the healthcare system in China. One thing to note is that, again, the Chinese government should have a lot of room to implement these fiscal policies. This is a chart based on data from BIS, Bank of International Settlements, that compares government debt over GDP ratios in large economies, US, Germany, UK, Japan, large emerging economies, other BRIC countries, Brazil and India. So the Chinese figure is about 50%. That includes both debt by the central government. Actually, central government debt in China is very low. It's only 20% of GDP. And then local government, it's about 30%. Okay? So that ratio, that total government debt over GDP, remains low compared to other large economies. We know that Japan's had a very high government debt burden, over 200%. Among the developed nations, Germany has been very fiscally responsible, but obviously we expect them to have a lot of fiscal stimulus. U.S. Government debt is approaching 100%. I'm sure after this year it's going to go over 100%. So, anyways, this is just showing you that there should be a lot of room for fiscal stimulus in China. Very quickly, this is showing you stock market movements and performance this year. So we start in January 1st all the way till April 7th. I'm comparing three indices: the main Shanghai Composite Index, the Hang Seng that's in Hong Kong, and also the S&P 500. What's been interesting is that the Chinese A-share, what we call the A-share market, if you look at its history, I've actually done a lot of research looking at the Chinese A-share markets movements. In the past, compared to the U.S. market and compared to Hong Kong, the A-share market was very volatile. But at least for the first quarter this year, it seems that the A-share market has done reasonably well in terms of volatility. If you eyeball these lines, it's actually less than what's been going on in Hong Kong and U.S. We know that U.S. Stock market has been extremely volatile, and also there was a big drop in late January and when the market was reopened on February 3rd. But it seems that it's holding up reasonably well. If you look at the stock market by industries, consistent with what's going on in a lot of other stock markets, technology and healthcare have been doing very well, better than the overall market. And the overall A-share market, if you look at the valuation level, is very reasonable. So there should be plenty of investment opportunity. And also, what's important is that the A-share now has a much larger share in the global MSCI index. So we do see more foreign capital coming in to invest in the Chinese markets. All right, so my final topic is to look at SMEs. So first is challenges and then opportunities. So in China, we've been talking about there's a lot of difficulties, right? But overall, we say that they have difficulties in the three flows. Okay, so in Chinese we say 人流、物流、现金流. All right, so basically the flow of people, especially labor, the flow of cash flows. So we already said that most small SMEs don't have enough cash to withstand a very long shock, and also goods and services. Okay, obviously SMEs, their ability to move these labor, cash, or labor and goods and services is not great to begin with. And obviously, after this disruption, after this pause, they face a lot of challenges of moving people back, generating enough cash flows to stay afloat, and also moving goods and services. So some of these are based on myself, economists talking to SMEs. So if you look at the labor market, for example, the first when this recovery started in early March, mid-March, at that point, the biggest challenge was moving people around, right? Because a lot of Hubei was in lockdown, but then it was actually not easy to move people around. Now, one of the things that's important for these SMEs is that they need to maintain a healthy enough environment at work, right? Including provide enough supplies for workers and for managers. Okay. When we talk to a lot of SMEs in China, they'll tell you that obviously you need to get people back, you need to get the orders back. Logistics is important, but once you get the people back, once you start to recover, to resume production and services, maintaining flexibility in hiring people is actually very important for them, for SMEs, because labor cost is a big chunk, especially for SMEs in the stage of just starting to resume production. So maintaining a very flexible labor force is one of the keys. Obviously, SMEs also face particular challenges along the product and supply chains. We know that we have these very extensive global product and supply chains, a lot of disruptions, first happening in China, now outside China. We know that SMEs are important parts, but typically on these chains, they're not that independent in some sense. They rely on large firms. They rely on upstream firms. They rely on large firms. So in the Chinese experience, SMEs are usually late in resuming work because they need to wait pretty much until all the large firms, all the major parts along these chains are back to work, and then they can get back to work. Right? So the timing for them is an issue. Obviously, logistics is an issue as well. The other thing is, as I said, even though net exporting is not as important for the Chinese GDP as 20 years ago, still a lot of SMEs specialized or they work for import and exporting companies. Obviously, the first shock came from that they cannot go back to work. And now the second shock is that basically there's a huge drop in foreign demand. So as I showed you earlier, a lot of SMEs are facing these problems in that in the first 2 months they cannot deliver order, and now they get their order canceled. So that's obviously a big issue for these SMEs to resume work. So they need help from everybody. All right. So the government, these policies we've already talked about, financial institutions extending loans, giving them provide debt relief, also helping them with cash flows. Business partners around the supply chains, these are also very important. Obviously, if the global supply chain and trade system can recover to some extent, would also help. All right. So those are the challenges facing SMEs. And if you look at the degree of recovering to full capacity, a lot of SMEs in particular sectors are lagging behind. But at the same time, this is really my last slide. I do want to end on a positive note in that there are a lot of opportunities related to technology. So again, these are recent stories, actually anecdotal evidence by talking to not only these entrepreneurs, farmers, producers, but also talking to financial institutions like WeBank, which lend to a lot of these very small firms. So an interesting example is actually agriculture. In certain parts of the country, farmers operate on very large patches of land. So the use of drones is now actually very frequent, or becoming more and more frequent. The use of drone is coupled with these tracking devices. And then on the smartphone, farmers can use their app to do just about everything. They can rent. They can even rent livestock. They can order things. They can sell things online on their smartphones. What's interesting here is that the apps also, the tracking devices and the apps can be linked to financial institutions, which lend to these farmers. All right. So actually, and again, with the signals from the drones, lending institutions actually have a good idea on how the farming is going, on the farming activity is going. So that's pretty cool. That's technology. Obviously, if you can do anything online, do online. So I'm not going to go over all of these examples. One thing that's interesting is that for education, right? So there's all kinds of numbers, but it's been, schools like universities and all the way to kindergarten. Every day, tens of millions of Chinese students have been taking online courses using a lot of different softwares. At my school, we've been offering online classes for a month and a half. In my own household, I teach online courses, sometimes at home, sometimes at a studio at the school. My daughter, she's in 6th grade, so she's taking online classes. So, it's not exactly the same as sitting in a classroom talking to students face to face, but you manage. Obviously, this process of learning is not completely stopped. So there are a lot of things can be transferred online. There's a very large event in China. it's the hosting city is Guangzhou. What they do is in the spring, this is called the Export Expo, Chinese Export Expo. So what they do is they invite all the foreign buyers to Guangzhou, and then all the Chinese companies show their products, right? Obviously, they can't do that this year. It's okay. They do that online. They're going to do online export expo. So technology also can help consumption, right? So restaurants have been hit very hard, but if you look at in terms of the food consumption, it actually hasn't dropped that much, in part because people use this online ordering delivery services has been very, very extensive. So as long as these delivery bikes are roaming around the city, people can order, can consume at home. And finally, financial institutions also can do a lot of things online, including lending to SMEs all over the country. So if I would like to summarize, maybe a few things, three things. The overall economic activity has slowly but steadily gone back to normal. Chinese government still has a lot of tools in their toolbox, second. And finally, for SMEs, they continue to face a lot of challenges, but technology and the digital economy has helped cushion the loss in economic activities and production, and technology has also generated a lot of new opportunities. So I guess I'll stop here and I'll hand over to our host in the studio.
Great. Thank you so much for that very insightful presentation, Professor Chen. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Wong. I host the Global Business Program here at CGTN. Just a quick note, Professor, you mentioned a lot of aggregate economic indicators. Of course, next week, audience, we do have that crucial first quarter GDP number for China coming out next Friday, the 17th of April. We also have total retail sales as well as fixed asset investment and industrial value add coming out next Friday as well, in addition to trade data, which I believe is coming out on the 15th, April the 15th. All right, so we are now in our free discussion session. This is going to be around 20 minutes. Like Professor Chen mentioned, we've got three wonderful guests from all around the world. In New York City, we have Anthony Chan, the former Chase chief economist at JP Morgan Chase. In London, we have Ian Begg, who is a professorial research fellow at the European Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is also the co-director of the Dahrendorf Forum there as well. And then in Singapore, we have Lin Tai Wei, who is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore. So welcome to you all. And just a reminder, this is free discussion, so I'm not going to be moderating questions. Folks, feel free to jump in whenever you want to. And then afterwards, we'll have an online discussion. We'll open it up to our online audiences where they can raise questions in real time. So how about we start with you, Anthony, over in New York City. Feel free to share your thoughts on what you just heard from Professor Chen.
Well, I'm certainly impressed with the recovery that China has made since the virus hit earlier in the year. But one of the things that we should also acknowledge is that China certainly is at a disadvantage because a lot of the medications that we continue to make progress with, China did not have access to all of these early on. I also want to point out that another negative headwind for China at this moment is that just as they've made sufficient and great and impressive progress, we also see that now the global economy is suffering, and that will mean that the export demand for Chinese products will certainly suffer. We in fact saw yesterday that the IMF this week basically telling us that now the global economy goes into basically a global recession, when just a few months ago, the IMF was forecasting 3.3% real GDP growth. That number, of course, has become negative. So there's no doubt that on top of the huge negative impact on the growth in the first calendar quarter, now the recovery in China, which should be taking place now that they have successfully made significant progress on the virus, will be significantly and negatively impacted by the negative global forces for real GDP growth?
Yes, thanks very much. So again, I agree 100% that if you look at the corporate sectors in China, this is the second wave of shocks. So a couple of things. Obviously, the hope is that the situation in Europe and US will stabilize, and we hopefully will see some sort of initial recovery in the US and Europe as well. We can look forward to that. In terms of the near term, as you said, the decreased demand globally has shown up very much so in the orders facing these firms, canceled orders. So a couple of things that we are watching how the Chinese factories are dealing with this, which is not as you can imagine, it's not a smooth process. So one is if the exported goods, you can find a domestic buyer, that's one solution. So basically that's basically exporting goods transfer to domestic consumption. That's one. The other thing that we're observing is that, in fact, the overall situation in Asia, particularly if you look at China, Korea, South Korea, Japan, and also most of the Southeast Asian countries, again, every country is hit by the virus somewhat, but overall the situation has been stable. And most of these economies are also, they're not like completely shut down. So hopefully there could be some trade flows in this region. In fact, if you look at China, Korea, and Japan, so the trade between these three countries is actually the third largest, after obviously US and EU. But you're absolutely right. In the short run, until the global demand comes back, it's going to be very tough recovery facing most of these factories, especially those factories specialized or are dedicated to exporting goods and services.
Professor Chen, can I just jump in really quick? Yes, we do have a lot of gloomy forecasts, but I was just wondering, do you think once China stabilizes, because we are past peak infection rates here in this country, that when we see China's economic recovery, that can provide more a sense of a stability for East Asia at least, and then eventually that can, at least when the Chinese economy starts to recover, help to spur a more globally led recovery as well?
Absolutely. I think if you look at the IMF data, since the last global financial crisis, basically the growth of Chinese economy is very important for global economic growth. So as long as Chinese economy continue to recover, the good thing is it will also generate demand. I mean, some of that demand cannot be fulfilled at the moment, but at least will generate demand for all the other economies. But at the time being, certainly, if you look at the Asian economy circles, if you look at the Asia Pacific circle, there is a lot of trade. There are a lot of trade activities going on, and that could be the first region globally to recover, and that will have a bigger pull, if you will, on the global economy. And again, as soon as Europe and the US start to stabilize, economic activities will resume. Hopefully, we'll have accelerated global recovery.
Professor, first of all, I want to also mention a great presentation, very comprehensive. I really enjoyed it. I totally agree. As soon as China recovers, it will certainly add stimulus to the rest of the Asia Pacific region. But one country that concerns me is Japan, because we know that when they imposed the sales tax, that was a negative, put a lot of negative pressure on economic growth. And now, as you can see, they're having some issues with COVID-19 or the coronavirus. So when you combine the two effects of the negative pressures from the sales tax that they imposed before the virus, and of course now with some increasing medical pressures, do you think that Japan will certainly not be as beneficial in the short run, while the other economies that you mentioned correctly will be much more positive. But given the size of Japan, it has to be a concern.
Yeah, so that is unfortunate. On the hopefully on the more positive side, I think all the economies, all the governments must be seriously thinking about all types of stimulus policies they can have, right, to stimulate domestic production and demand. I talked about the fiscal and monetary policies in China. I mean, I look at the situation now because of the huge drop in global demand. That's going to hit the Chinese economy a second wave. So I support a second wave of more aggressive both monetary and fiscal stimulus in China, especially helping these SMEs. So let's see if the Japanese government can perhaps. I mean, I agree with you 100%. At this point, you should lower barriers. You should give all the incentives for people to produce and to consume. I think lower taxes, at least temporarily, is a very, very reasonable economic policy. But you're right. Japan is a very, very important economy in Asia. It's a very important trade partner with China. So let's hope that they will take more supportive policies in the short run.
I think Ian has a question, Professor Chen.
Sure.
Well, if you allow me, I'll do the very French thing and say I have 3 points. The first point is that there's been a lot of talk about the downturn being very sharp, and then the upturn being equally sharp, a rebound, so-called the V-shaped recession. But if I listened carefully to what you said, QJ, I think you told us that there was a slow recovery taking place. Many companies not back to full capacity by any means, and particularly in the service sector, even less further away from a full recovery. Now, this makes me wonder, has the demand that's been lost been suspended, or is it simply lost forever, so that the possibility of a very strong rebound may be exaggerated? That's my first point. Okay. The second is, in your remarks, you said several times factories are back to work. But factories, by definition, are the manufacturing sector, particularly for the parallels that we might draw for European countries, where manufacturing can be as low as under 10% of GDP. And the biggest impact of this lockdown has been felt on the services sector. What's the experience of the Chinese service sector as opposed to manufacturing? It was in some of your data, but I'd like you to try to draw out the key message from it. And the third point I'd make is, in all of this, I'm currently working on a paper on the expression burden sharing. Who is going to bear the cost of this crisis? Is it the general taxpayer through the fiscal stimulus? Are shareholders going to be wiped out? Are banks going to take big hits? It's interesting to speculate on the distribution of the costs of this. I'd recently had a fresh look at Maynard Keynes' famous pamphlet, How to Pay for the War, and it's worth rereading by everybody.
Thanks, Professor Bex. These are wonderful questions. I'll have a try as we discuss like this in an academic seminar. Back in late January, my colleagues and I were doing some projection. All right, just like most other people. At that point, we based on the virus spreading data and all that stuff, we were basically pretty comfortable with the recovery starting in late March and picked up steam in April. And we did say there will be a V-shaped recovery. I guess 2 months later, when I look back at the prediction model we did, I think we were reasonably right about China. What we didn't get was how bad the situation will get outside China. So certainly, as you can see, the the CERI, the WeBank people's data, because they share everything with me. They did say that you can see that in March, first 3 weeks of March, because our data is based on footprints, based on people moving. The space, the picked up space, the pace of recovery was quick. And then, especially to these manufacturing sectors. So overall, I think the statement is right that if you look at manufacturing sectors, they are back to closer to full capacity relative to services. And then in late March and early April, you do see that slow down somewhat. And again, that's correlated with what's going on outside China. So certainly, even if I remain somewhat hopeful that when much of Europe and the U.S. Get the virus situation under control, when they start to recover, that demand will come back. I'm still hopeful that we will see a global recovery. Maybe it's not a very sharp V, but there will be a pickup. But certainly for China at this stage, the recovery clearly is not as quick as we anticipated, in part because of the spread of the virus around the globe. So that's the first question. Now, whether some of the demand is lost forever, in terms of like tourists, tourism, maybe they're lost for the year, but I think people, once you tell them it's safe to travel, at least some of that will come back. So hopefully not all the lost demand will be permanent. So that's my attempt to answer your first question. Second, you asked about manufacturing versus consumption. I think that statement is right, although again, I don't have a very good micro level data. So again, we are talking to a large bank. I think with the bank level, loan level data, we could see a better picture of these firms, manufacturing versus consumption or service.
No versus consumption, versus services.
With services, you're right.
There's a distinction to be made there.
Yes. I do think that the recovery is stronger at manufacturing than services. So that is the case. For China, services now is also very important. One of the facts, although I don't have very good data to back it up, is that for demand for the services, perhaps it was not completely lost because a lot of these activities have been shifted online. But we'll have a better picture with more data coming out. The third question is a great one. I think that's, I guess as economists, we do think about fairness and also efficiency. I guess the government for sure has to bear some part of that loss. If you're an investor in the stock market, at least you've already taken some loss. If you look at financial institutions, as I said, overall if you look at the banking sector, the Chinese banking sector was in good enough shape. The large banks are doing well. There are some regional small banks were not doing that well. They probably will be hit harder. So I guess in the end, it will be some sort of a sharing among all the stakeholders or participants of the economy. There's a lot of discussion in China about, because I mentioned this point about labor, right? So there's a lot of, and you see different countries have very different plans. Whether you give workers money or you give money to firms, or you give money to firms conditional on they're not firing their workers. Because SMEs in general, SMEs are very important. They're a very large number. My own view is, in the short run, it's important to have as many SMEs going back to production and going back to provide services as possible. you must have that before you can talk about having wage income for all the workers. So to me, I think that's why I actually had that as a bullet point to say that for SMEs, maintain a flexible hiring schedule is very important for them. And then, but obviously, you need to make sure that people have the maintain a minimum living standard in all areas. So,
if you allow me just to interject there, there's one very interesting scheme that was tried already 10 years ago in Germany called Kurzarbeit, short-time working.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than fire people, they put people on shorter terms of work, shorter hours of work. And that was very successful in maintaining employability for the future. I noticed that the French are now trying that as well. So that may be something to bring into the dialogue at some point.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I want to add to that is that what's interesting is that, you know, that the restaurants are hit very hard, right? Yep. So what you observe in China is that, as you know, people use all these APPs to order food. So all these APP companies, delivery companies, their orders, like, you know.
Professor Chan, I'm going to interrupt just real quick. We're a bit short on time. I see that Taiwei also has a question. Can we get to Taiwei real quick?
Okay, thank you, Professor Chen, for your very informative presentation. I was focusing on 2 points. Over the last week, there has been encouraging news from the 4 engines of growth in the world economy. We saw that US had a $2.3 trillion US dollar stimulus package, and Japan followed up with a $1 trillion package, and the EU has concluded a $3.5 cumulated trillion dollar package. And China has also released $200 billion US dollars credits to small and medium-sized companies, and released $150 billion US dollars for infrastructure building, particularly to subcontractors. So a lot of us in Southeast Asia are also wondering if you have any insights into the stimulus come, particularly to tide over domestic economies at a time when there's a shutdown in many countries in the world. And you mentioned about cash coupons or just cash itself. So if you can sort of illuminate some ideas about what you think might be the solution for domestic sort of stimulus, that would be great. And many of these stimulus packages are actually aimed at domestic markets. Some of us are also wondering if China would be having any packages external to China itself, particularly to sort of work with other countries to stimulate other economies. So that's my first question. My second question is also, like you, I'm very interested in online education. As you know, part of the ASEAN economic community, Singapore and other countries are putting together 15 countries for the Smart City initiative. And certainly online education is a very large component of the Smart City initiative. And given China's interest in this area, I wonder if you have any insights into how China can work with other countries in terms of a Smart City initiative, including, but not just exclusively, to online education, as you have mentioned. Once again, thank you for a very, very informative presentation. Looking forward to learning from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those wonderful, for the encouragement and for the questions. So I think for the stimulus within China, we do see, I expect to see more both monetary and fiscal stimulus. As I said, that if you look at the monetary side, they can cut the rates, they can cut the required reserve ratio, among other things. For the fiscal side, this is done by the consumption coupons are done by the local governments. So again, I haven't seen this is like collecting news articles. So it seems like no city or provincial government has given out cash to people. But a lot of cities and the provincial government give out consumption coupons. I guess the idea behind that is that they give you cash, you might not spend it, but they give you consumption coupon, you have to spend it. That's the idea. They might extend that. They have given subsidies to firms, and that might continue. And then the big one is the what's called the new infrastructure plans. There are different plans being floated around, very, very large scale, in trillions of RMB and trillions of dollars, actually. The point I was making is that if you look at the last global crisis, the infrastructure projects, especially high-speed rail, has been very important in sustaining economic growth for the longer run. And this time, infrastructure should include technology like 5G, all that stuff, and the medical system. In terms of what will China do something externally? I do believe that. Again, as I said, the Southeast Asian economies and East Asian economies in China, this circle, if you will, is very important, and it should continue to develop. Less trade barriers, more exchange of goods and services. I do expect that China will also help other countries in terms of infrastructure and perhaps some other related projects. I do expect that. That's my answer to your first question. The second thing is on online education and the smart city. These are great initiatives. So this online education, again, it's in the beginning, people like myself have been teaching forever. It takes time to get used to it, but after a while, in some sense, I was talking to Professor Bex about economic efficiency. If you can have cross-country, so this is already happening. Universities are now hosting cross-international seminars, like what we're doing now. That's actually pretty efficient. I can hear what Professor Beck's thoughts about Europe, what's going on in the UK, very quickly, without flying all the way to London. So I think the education, online education, I take that as the whole industry can do more online in terms of very quick exchange of ideas and knowledge without incurring a lot of this communication cost. So that's actually very good, even though some form of classroom interaction is important for a lot of schools, for example. So I do see that these online knowledge sharing platforms will continue to grow. And that's
Michael, can I jump in here with the question?
A real quickie, and I think we're a bit short on time. We want to get our online
It's a very quick one, because when we look at the stimulus packages that were just been referred to, there are a combination of grants, direct cash payments, loans, and guarantees, of which the second two form by far the biggest part. And I think we have to be very sensitive in this to the longer term implications of having a huge increase in indebtedness, not just of the state, but also of the borrowers in the private sector.
Yes, that's quick. I agree. So one point I didn't mention today was that in the last stimulus, the 4 trillion stimulus in 2008-09, most of that was in the terms of newly issued bank loans. So the credit stimulus. Whenever you have a large credit stimulus in a short period of time, you have to worry. There are these debt problems in the coming months and years. So yes, absolutely.
Okay. We're going to leave it there for now. Just in terms of worrying about the future, in terms of whether or not that's going to grow indebtedness, I think China's more targeted approach towards lending for SMEs and for different sectors, I think that might come into some help in terms of making sure companies or households don't go too much into debt. I do want to open it up now to our online audience. Our audience online are asking real-time questions right now. We have one question on Twitter from Summer May 527. And this person wants to ask you, Professor Chen, what has China done specifically to help small and medium-sized enterprises in Wuhan after the lockdown was lifted on April the 8th? Again, 76 days of lockdown in Wuhan. Small businesses make up over 90% of China's businesses, so it's very, very crucial to see SMEs recover.
That's a great question. Everything we have talked about in the slides, giving subsidies to SMEs. If you look at the experience, let me back up a little. If you look at the experience of all the other regions, how they recover, the first point of business is that you've got to move people around. All right, so that's happening. The factories, the companies in Wuhan need to get their employees back. So that's happening. Two, in China now, actually, there's a condition for work, right? So you need to maintain a quote unquote healthy environment because this virus is not going away. I think now it's better than a month and a half ago. And a month and a half ago, for any firm, SMEs, you need to get a clearing process. You need to get the government to clear, to allow you to approval to resume working. I suppose that procedure now is very easy for companies in Wuhan. We know that financial institution banks, new types of financial institutions have already been continue lending, extending loans to all the SMEs, including Wuhan. I know that the regulators, the government, will have different approaches in terms of treating defaults. They will tell banks that be more lenient in terms of when you deal with SMEs when they're late on their payments. And then there's all sorts of waiving of rents, waiving of costs, cutting taxes. So all of that is happening. And finally, as I said, Wuhan is actually important for certain industries on the Chinese and global product chain. So once they join, actually it's good. It's good for SMEs in other parts of China to complete the recovery of the entire chain. So I do see companies in Wuhan recover quickly than the other parts because we've already have a month and a half of recovery data, if you will. So I'm expecting more pointed policies to help SMEs in Wuhan.
Yeah, and with other provinces recovering as well, that should also spur the recovery in Wuhan as well, especially on the e-commerce front, where people all across the country buying products from Wuhan and supporting SMEs. We have a question from Jeffrey Lau, Professor Chen. He says actually that one day of a lockdown of a city like Wuhan having over 10 million inhabitants means a direct economic loss of about $280 million US. That's what he says. So his question is, how can China balance the cost of the economy and the benefits of saving lives? What can other countries learn from that? What do you think? It's a very delicate balancing act, right?
Absolutely. This is a question, myself as an economist, so obviously I do this calculation, but I give the Chinese government, I give all the medical workers in China a lot of credit. They've done a great job. I think from what's been going on in China and also from other countries, to deal with this virus, you do need very strict restrictions on human movement. That seems to be the only way to effectively prevent the outbreak. And only when the outbreak is under control can you talk about economic recovery. So I think that the good news out of China is that once you see, I think recently, 2 weeks ago, there was a paper published by Science or Nature, maybe Science, that showed they actually have this projected data. Based on actual data, they projected that if the city of Wuhan was not locked down, the number of patients in all of China will something like triple or quadruple or more. If Wuhan is locked down, but other cities, other parts of China are not quarantined, that's not enough. I think this is very convincing data to me that you must take care of people's lives first, and then when this virus is under control, now if you look at China, because this virus is not completely gone, you do face this delicate balance. Okay, so schools, we're not inviting our students back on campus yet. Even when we do, there's a balance, and that's a balance not only the local government officials have to take, it's also taken by all these employers. They need to make sure that people have enough space, social distancing while at work. So it is a delicate balance, but I think the data out of China tells myself that this is the best way, the only way is you stop the virus first, stop enough, and then you have a reasonably quick recovery, rather than having a partial lockdown, because this virus is not going to go away. I think the approach taken by China and a lot of Asian countries, of course, there are ways you can help the lockdown, but that's the best way to go, and not have a partial lockdown and have other parts of the country working. I don't think that's going to work. It's better to lock down everybody, stop the virus, and then you have a quick recovery. That's my conclusion.
Okay, I think Anthony has a question for you, Professor Chen.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, but I think there you basically really state very clearly that when you basically want to make sure that you hold people locked down, that influences, as Professor Begg indicated, that there's going to be negative impacts on the service sector. Because I think most people looking at China from the outside agree with you in your theory that the manufacturing sector is making great progress, but that social distancing is still hurting the service sector and will continue to hurt the service sector for quite some time until China feels very comfortable that it's okay to completely open up and allow free movement. And of course, Chinese people also themselves to feel very comfortable that they're actually allowing, that they feel confident that they can move around. As the point on what China is doing, I'm also very impressed. If you look at total social finance, credit is growing very quickly. In fact, greater than the consensus was expecting. You see the broader M2 money supply growing at over 10% year over year. So, and you see the 7-day repo rate also being reduced. So they're doing everything they can to provide all the credit. But your point is spot on. Until China feels comfortable opening up the social movement of people, you're not going to see the service sector recovering to the extent that we'd like to see it.
I agree.
Could I add something there, which is, I think, very important to recognize, even though it's an extremely uncomfortable point to make, and that is there's a strong correlation between economic downturn and other forms of illness.
That's true.
And as a result of that, there's going to be a crossover point where the damage to people from other sources, particularly where there's poverty involved, and we've already seen the huge increase in unemployment claimants in the US and other countries. The effect of that is going to be to create new forms of health difficulties, which could easily overtake those that result from keeping the lockdown on COVID-19. And that uncomfortable thing is, I think, something we as economists have to present to the public.
Sure. Coming back to Professor Beck's excellent point, I went back to the hospital to get some medications which I haven't refilled for a while, right? Because it's closed. I mean, I do see a lot of people at one of the Fudan's hospitals. So I asked my doctor, and he said, you know what? Because now people are coming back to treat all the other diseases, because the medical system was basically at capacity level to deal with the virus. So again, this point is very important, but related to what I said, again, if you have very effective restrict people's movements and with testing, you will have enough capacity in the medical with patients. And that's actually very important. That in the short run can free up, can at least have some capacity in hospitals to treat the other patients. This is what happened in Wuhan. It's happening in parts of Italy, and it's also happening in New York, because the hospital system are just completely overwhelmed by treating patients related to the virus. They just didn't have enough capacity for the others. So again, it's early.
QJ, it's not just about capacity in the hospitals. I agree with your point there. What I'm saying is that there's an additional effect from induced sickness as a result of recession or severe recession.
Yes.
And I think there's so much evidence from the US, particularly on drug use as a result of it, that it's something really we have to be deeply concerned about.
Professor Begg, that's absolutely correct. That's why in the United States, with the new stimulus plan, you take a person that was making $17,000 a year. I live in New York City. That means they'll get about $468 a week during that transition period, and the government is going to enhance it by another $600. So that person that was making $17,000 during this period, where the government gives you more money, they'll be making on an annualized basis about $34,000 to exactly address the point that you're making, to make sure that somebody that was making $17,000 a year doesn't all of a sudden gets very depressed, thinks about suicide, depression, because now they'll be earning twice as much during that transition period where the government is going to enhance the unemployment benefits.
Taiwei, do you have something to add to all of this?
Yeah, in the East Asian economies, it appears that some East Asian economies are dipping into their reserves to tide over the shutdown and the lockdown, while other East Asian economies are sort of keeping certain essential services like restaurants or supermarkets open, so that there's no total collapse of the retail sector. So I was also wondering, would China do like a balance between the two, dip into the reserve to help those who have no choice but to close down, especially the night entertainment industries, and at the same time keep some of these eateries and retail outlets open, so that there's no total collapse of the retail sector?
So what's going on in China is that, because most parts of the country, I don't have very good data on this, but in my own neighborhood in Shanghai, the restaurants have been open. They just didn't have enough guests. Now we're at a point where people start to feel comfortable going back to restaurants. So you do see restaurants having more and more people dining in. Again, people are getting very much used to the social distancing. You see the dining tables are not like very close to each other. And the other thing is, at least during the lockdown, the food service is not stopped because of this the digital economy and delivery service. The other point I want to add is that one of the arguments. I'm sorry,
Professor Chen. We're going to end our session today because we're out of time. But thank you all for some great insights, some great questions. I think what we want to gather from all of this is that this is seriously a very deep crisis for the entire world, and we do need to show economic solidarity in all parts of the world. And it's interesting because we keep on talking about balancing between saving lives and then saving the economy. But that sort of reminds me, there's an interesting op-ed by the IMF and WHO, both of them recently saying that it's a bit of a false trade-off. It's a bit of a false dilemma to think about this trade-off between jobs and lives, because you really do need to save jobs. That's a prerequisite before we can get the economy going again. So that might be some food for thought as we end this session. All right, so thank you all for joining us wherever you may be. Thank you to our three wonderful guests, Anthony Chan in New York City, Ian Begg in London, as well as Lin Taiwei over in Singapore, and of course, Professor Chen Jun, the Executive Dean of the Fanhai International School of Finance at Fudan University. Thank you to you all. This is part one of our three-part series on how economies can mitigate the impact of COVID-19 around the world. We're going to have two more sessions. The next one is going to be on the 17th of April, also at 9 p.m. Beijing Beijing time. I believe that is going to be 9 a.m. in New York City, as well as 13 GMT. So do make sure to join us for that as well. In that session, we're going to talk about how financial technology can be used to stem the economic fallout from COVID-19. And then in the third session, we're going to talk in more detail about how Chinese companies manage to cope through the COVID-19 crisis and what lessons they can share to the world. All right, so thank you all very much. CGTN's Think Tank, of course, will be also working and cooperating with other institutions all around the world to bring you more insights and thought leadership in terms of how we can get through all of this together and how China and the world can better work together to stem the coronavirus. All right, I'm Michael Wong in Beijing. Thank you all for joining us on this wonderful session. We'll see you again next time.
Thank you.
Good evening, Michael. Bye.
Thank you very much.